organized in three parts. So we've got a video to just get us into the mood. Then we have SRSG joining us to give us a keynote address, getting us thinking around the the Sendai Framework, and just from her imagination what we should be thinking about. We then have examples from around the world on what different countries, different organizations are trying to do in this space, and then we have a discussion on what we're all hearing. And hopefully we stick to time. In 10:30 I'll say thank you, and we move to the next, to tea, which is where I think all of you can take a break again. With that, I'd like to get started, so let's start with the video.
Wild cyclones, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, and droughts. The world saw it all in the last decade. Communities were disrupted, populations displaced, and infrastructure damaged. There seems to be no respite in the near future. The UN warns that there will be at least 560 climate-related disasters every year till 2030. Over the past 8 years, the world has recorded some of the hottest temperatures. The globe is already 1.1 degrees warmer, and it is unlikely that we will meet the 1.5 degree target. Now, more than ever, the international community must come together to mitigate the impact of disasters. Develop effective risk reduction strategies and build resilient infrastructure. The world needs massive investments between now and 2050 to close the infrastructure gap. With over half of the infrastructure required yet to be built, the world is presented with a unique opportunity. Building resilient infrastructure requires strong global collaboration and a diverse set of integrated strategies. India has repeatedly emphasized the importance of developing resilient infrastructure that can withstand disasters. The Honorable Prime Minister of India, in his 10-point agenda on DRR, urged to wholeheartedly embrace the spirit of the Sendai Framework. For the rapid development of resilient infrastructure, it has become increasingly important for countries to measure risk and reduce infrastructure losses. It is now even more crucial to understand vulnerabilities in infrastructure systems and integrate risk reduction in infrastructure financing. Making physical risk visible as a public good will enable the generation of knowledge of hazard risk assessments, disaster-resilient technologies, and innovative financing to address those risks. Under India's presidency, the G20 countries have prioritized DRR. The key objective is to find agreement towards making infrastructure systems disaster and climate resilient. This is the moment to ask ourselves crucial questions. Let's delve deeper to understand how we can collectively work towards making infrastructure systems disaster and climate resilient. Thank you for watching.
So I think that's a little bit of a powerful video, and whenever I watch it, it gives me, I won't say goosebumps, but motivates me. With that, I'm honored to invite Ms. Mami Mizutori to the stage. Ms. Mizutori is the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction based in Geneva, Switzerland. Ma'am.
Good morning, and another very important day for this working group. Thank you very much, Amit, for inviting me to be the keynote speaker, and I thank the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and UNDP for organizing this side event. I do remember quite vividly that when India hosted the Asian Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in 2016, under the leadership of, as we have seen, Prime Minister Modi, this idea of creating this coalition came up, and we worked very closely, the Indian government and UNDRR, and in 2019 at the Climate Action Summit of the UN Secretary General, it was launched. And I think the key word, there are many key words, is that we have a very important opportunity in front of us to make infrastructure resilient when we think about the vast amount of infrastructure which is going to be established, created, constructed between now and 2040. And also importantly, we know that the vast majority of that infrastructure, the investment will come from the private sector. So it's also very important that we involve the private sector in this discussion, and CDRI is already doing that. Yesterday we already started talking about the importance of the resilience of infrastructure. Of course, as many pointed out yesterday, investing in infrastructure in itself is a big driver of sustainable development. But of course, if they are not resilient, it is not sustainable. Even at normal times, but more so when disaster hits, if your infrastructure does not function, does not withstand, then many times you see a secondary disaster happening, including like waterborne diseases, etc. So it is critically important that our infrastructure is resilient before, during, and after disasters. And this is quite obvious, but when we look at the reality, when we look at what has been reported to target D of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is to reduce damage to critical infrastructure and disruption to basic services, as I presented yesterday, the picture is not very good. So globally, we are seeing that on an annual base, on average, there are 142,000 cases of destruction to infrastructure between 2015 and 2021, which has been reported to the Sendai Framework monitoring system. In terms of disruption to critical service, 8 out of 20 of the G20 are reporting that there has been, again, on an average annual base, 100,000 disruption to basic service, including health and education. But I must say here that we don't have the full picture at all. This is what has been reported, so if there is a full report on this target D, I think that we have an even worse picture here. So we really need to transform our approach to how we design, how we construct, and how we maintain our infrastructure so that they become more resilient. And I would like to share with you 4 things, 4 important issues that was actually in the theme, and what UNDRR is doing in supporting member states to achieve this. So the first thing is that, and as we always say, to understand the risk around resilient infrastructure. And of course, we need to understand all the three elements of risk, as we know, which are hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. But I would like to emphasize here that in terms of hazard, so of course, countries which were prone to disasters for many years, in fact centuries, including Japan, they are very aware of the geophysical hazard to infrastructure. But now we also have to put in the climate related hazards. And I would say that although it is not explicitly written into the Sendai Framework, hazard or risk such as cyber attacks needs to be put in unless we are not really understanding the risk that can undermine the stability and resilience of our infrastructure. And for this component of understanding the risk around infrastructure, UNDRR is taking forward a program which is called Risk Information Exchange. This is a program that supports countries to aggregate all the disaster risk information that already exists around hazard, vulnerability, exposure. Because the fact is that we always say that we don't have enough data. That is true, but it's not true also. Because you do have a lot of data in your country which are owned by different people, even in different sectors in the government. In many cases, in developing countries, the UN system might have it, and sometimes the UN systems are siloed. So there's quite a lot of information around the three elements of risk in the country if you put them together. And what this risk information exchange program is trying to do, trying to support, is to bring all this information to one portal, and also to take forward capacity building so that the data can be transformed into risk-informed policies. So the first thing we need to do is to understand the risk better. Second is that we need to have an approach, a systemic approach to infrastructure, because infrastructure itself, as was pointed out yesterday as well, is now a system. The infrastructures do not stand alone. It's a system, infrastructure system that we are dealing with, so we can't deal with one type of infrastructure, whether it's energy or whether it's water or whether it's health on its own. And so we do need to have a systems approach to it, because as we have learned through COVID, and as we are learning through going, let's say trying to overcome the climate emergency, that everything is connected. So we do need to have an understanding of what is the resilience of our infrastructure system, and for this UNDRR has developed a tool which is called the Resilient Infrastructure Stress Tool. This enables countries to understand what is the vulnerability within their infrastructure system. And we have piloted this in several countries. We have asked the country to identify which sector of your infrastructure do you think could be the most vulnerable or could be the most crucial for your economic and social system. We apply this stress testing tool, and with this the country, and we have stress tested this in more at-risk countries, they can understand the vulnerability better, and then try to come up with a more systemic approach to having resilient infrastructure. And the third important thing is, once you understand the vulnerability in your infrastructure system, you do need to have a policy framework around this vulnerability. And for this, again, we have consulted with over 100 countries to come up with what we call the principles for resilient infrastructure. And this is a very basic, because they are principles, set of principles that should be applied when you look at your infrastructure framework. We are now almost at the end of coming up with a handbook which is based on these principles. And there's also some attempt by some groups to make this into an ISO. And we believe that with this principle that we have a somewhat global standard on what is resilient infrastructure. But the important thing is that these standards, these principles are adopted by member states. So this is what we are advocating for and supporting member states to adopt the principles for resilient infrastructure in their own countries. And fourth, last but not least, it's about financing resilient infrastructure. So in 2019 already, World Bank came up with a very important report which is called Lifeline. And the main message of this report, which is a report based on thousands of cases that World Bank researched, is that if you put in $1 into your infrastructure for resilience during the lifetime of the infrastructure, you will save $4. Need to put more financing into resilient infrastructure, including from the private sector. So those are the four main approaches that we need to have now. And this is why I think it's very important that one of the 5 priorities of this working group is about resilient infrastructure. We do believe that the approach, the implementation of these 4 approaches start with a political will on recognizing the importance of resilient infrastructure, and I think that is exactly what this priority of the working group of the G20 will be able to achieve. So I'll stop here and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those words. I think, understanding risk, capacity building, resilient infrastructure stress to the policy framework, financing, I think all of these are starting, you helped us organize the discussion a little bit. And with that, I'm going to invite the next round of panelists. Thank you so much. We have some very interesting case studies, again, from a variety of contexts, looking at infrastructure differently and in different institutional contexts. So I'm going to start with inviting Kiran McNamara. Kiran, can you join us on stage? Thanks. Ms. Lo Chang Cheng, thank you. Please join us. And I'm going to introduce all of you in a minute. So Ranjana Gupta, please join us. And Arun Kumar Tiwari, please join us. So, we've got Kiran, who's coming from the International Energy Agency. He's the head of Environment and Climate Change Unit, where he contributes to the strategic direction of ECC's climate, energy transitions, and environmental policy analysis, as well as its strategy for external cooperation and outreach. He's going to bring the perspective from IEA, which will be very interesting given the amount of investments that are going into green infrastructure right now. Ms. Lo Chang Cheng is currently the Director General for Environment and Infrastructure Policy, Advancing Infrastructure Canada's contribution to climate change mitigation and adaptation, environmental quality, and community support. She brings something that's very dear to my heart. Actually, a lot of things are dear to my heart, but she talks about nature-based solutions. I'm trained as a landscape architect, which most of you may not even know what the field might be, but it's about environmental planning and nature-based solutions, so very close to my heart there. Ms. Suranjana Gupta is the Senior Advisor on Community Resilience at the Huairou Commission, a global coalition focused on grassroots women's leadership in building sustainable, resilient, and gender-just communities. And we have Arun Kumar Tiwari, who presently works as the General Manager for Technical in the Dedicated Freight Corridor Corporation of India Limited, and looks after all technical matters related to civil engineering in DFC. So we have a diverse range of case studies. The format will be each presenter will present for about 5 minutes, and I'll pose a question to them, and then we'll go to the next presenter. So with that, I'd like to invite Kiran to the stage. Or you can, up to you if you want to be there or here.
Thank you very much. As Amit said, I come from the International Energy Agency, and today I'll talk a little bit about the work we've done on hydropower resilience and the implications changing climate patterns are likely to have for the broader energy sector as a result of changes in the hydropower sector. So firstly, hydropower today is the largest source of low emissions electricity we have, more than nuclear power, more than wind power, more than solar PV. Worldwide in 2020, it accounted for about 17% of total electricity supply. Among G20 countries, it was about 15% of supply, but the amount varies greatly, as you can see from the figure there, with some countries such as Brazil and Canada depend on hydro for as much as 60% of their power supply. In terms of the future, we anticipate that hydropower will continue to play a more major role in the electricity supply well into the 2030s. Now, its share may shrink a little bit, but its significance in the energy transmission will grow because hydropower will be one of our major sources of flexibility in the power system as we integrate more and more volumes of flexible electricity. So we will need it to balance the electricity supply and to integrate the huge amount of variables that are expected to come online by the end of this decade. And those variable sources such as solar PV and wind power will account for as much as 70 or 80% of new capacity additions over the next decade. So any changes, climate changes that impact the hydropower sector will have a much greater implication for the power sector as a whole. Now, if we talk about the latest IPCC AR6 synthesis report, and that tells us that today's energy systems are compromised by extreme and slow onset events leading to economic losses and disruptions of services. Shifting precipitation patterns attributable to climate change affect hydropower generation by altering stream flows and water availability. So this map shows us how much installed hydropower capacity will be exposed to changes in precipitation levels by the end of this century. Now, what you see in front of you here are the likely changes under a low emissions scenario or one with 2 degrees of warming. Now, you could argue that's not a low emissions scenario, but it's a scenario under 2 degrees of warming. And you can see that the levels of precipitation changes are somewhat manageable. The dry areas get somewhat drier, the wet areas get a little wetter. But if we move to a high emissions scenario, we see a huge shift. We see the dry regions getting much, much drier. We see the wet regions getting much, much wetter. In other words, this tells us if climate change is not mitigated and if resilience measures are not adopted in time, hydropower plants are likely in some regions to suffer hugely from water scarcity, while others in other parts of the world are struggling with flooding and increased water flows. These changes will undermine the reliable operation of the hydropower system, and this in turn will have huge implications for the integration of other variable sources of electricity, such as wind power, solar PV, and for the overall operation of the power system in terms of lower flexibility available. Now, we did some analysis of the climate impacts on hydropower in a selection of countries, almost 40 in all. And today I'll highlight 5 of those G20 countries which we focused on: Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Indonesia, and India. Now, based on using this work, we used a range of IPCC climate scenarios to model the impacts of changes on climate on the hydropower sector. So we looked at 3 scenarios: below 2 degrees, below 3 degrees, and above 4 degrees. And the black lines you see at the top of those columns indicate the average of the projections for each of the 3 scenarios. The graph illustrates that all 5 countries are likely to see a decrease in hydropower capacity factors over the course of the century, but the levels of this decrease will vary by location. So this means that the amount of time that the hydropower is available and running will decline over time as the temperature patterns change. The effect is much more marked in the Americas, in Argentina, in Brazil, and in Mexico than it is in India and Indonesia. And these latter two countries in Asia are likely to see a mean average increase of about 5% over the course of the century. So that means 5% less hydropower will be available to the power system. But the shift is much greater in the Americas, by as much as 15 to 20% in the cases of these three countries. And this has huge implications on the application and the management of the power system in these countries, particularly in Brazil, which I highlighted earlier, that depends on up to 60% hydropower for up to 60% of its power supply. Now, we heard earlier in the earlier keynote speech about the importance of building resilience into the infrastructure and the role governments have to play. It brings far more benefits and costs, and we heard about the World Bank study, a ratio of $4 to 1. So resilience in the power system supports uninterrupted electricity supply. It's a key element of our clean energy transitions, but more importantly, it's the cornerstone of economic development and social welfare. So enhancing resilience against climate change requires a range of actions by all stakeholders, not just the assets owners and the energy suppliers, but also from us, the consumers, the citizens, but also from governments. So governments and energy regulators specifically are expected to play a very, very important role in making sure the community is prepared for climate change. Firstly, the government, and we heard this earlier, provides information. It provides risk assessments. It conducts those assessments. It establishes an enabling environment. It mainstreams resilience into their energy and climate policies. More importantly, they create an environment for financing and investment in infrastructure. They support the availability of adequate climate insurance. They play an essential role in recovery, coordinating emergency responses and building preparedness. The IEA is doing what it can to contribute to building resilience against climate disasters in collaboration with our governments, other non-member governments, and with a diverse range of stakeholders. Our work across the entire energy value chain, from fuel production to power generation and consumption, takes this into account. We have lots of information on our website. Feel free to visit, download our reports, or come and talk to us. We're happy to meet with you all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to address you, and I look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kieran. I think it's actually sobering when I saw that graph of how the capacity of hydropower is going down, given that a lot of our focus is to shift away from traditional energy sources towards alternative sources, and hydropower being one of the key areas of opportunity. To see capacity going down just points to more and more infrastructure investments needed in that particular space. From your perspective, from the IEA's perspective, you've been now working with governments trying to highlight alternate energy sources, promoting alternative energy sources. Where are you finding maybe traction with governments? What do you think governments are, how are they reacting to all of this information? Are they even aware about the risks to from climate change, this capacity changes, etc.?
That's a very interesting question. Firstly, this study was about hydropower, but this analysis can be equally applied to other sources of energy. In rising temperature, in cases of rising temperature, shifting wind patterns, etc., we see similar trends in wind power. So we're likely to see a drop in wind power speeds in regions where most wind power is located over the future. So winds could drop by as much as 10%. And wind power capacity is a function of the cube of the wind speed. So we could see wind power speeds output drop by as much as 25, 26, 27%. Solar PV panels deteriorate as the temperature rises their effectiveness. The risks of flooding of other power assets. And we've seen that over the last 10, 15 years in many countries. And thirdly, higher water temperatures in cooler regions impacts the running of nuclear power plants and coal-fired plants. And over the last few years, we've seen shutdowns of both coal-fired plant and nuclear plant because of the lack of availability of cooling water. So this analysis and the outcome in terms of the drop in capacity can equally be applied to other energy sources. And we've done a lot of work with our member and non-member governments on resilience indicators for the sector. And what this analysis has told us, that about a quarter of the governments surveyed do not take resilience into account when they're planning and building their infrastructure. They have mitigation measures and they have adaptation measures which are far more sophisticated and advanced in other sectors, such as transport or water or food. But in terms of the energy infrastructure, it's not yet fully taken into account. And what we heard a lot over the last 2 days of build back better, but less eloquently, I would say, or we would say, why not build it best first time and spend that extra dollar in building the energy infrastructure? So build deeper foundations for wind pylons, build stronger support columns, build the rotor blades to withstand lower and higher wind speeds, build cooling systems for solar PV into the technology from the outset. In the future, we plan to see a lot of new coal-fired power plants built with CCUS to capture and store the carbon. This uses 50% more water than other technological solutions, so be prepared for that. The clean energy transition is going to require a lot more rare earth metals, minerals, etc. All of these require water. So this has to be taken into account when we plan to build those industries. So reflecting back on this Mizuno Beach and the World Bank study, the $1 for 4, invest that extra dollar now. You're going to get the reward and the feedback over the long term.
Thank you so much for those. And I think it just highlights, we're doing a study in coastal Odisha and looking at changing wind speeds and seeing how that affects transmission system. And what we're realizing is by a little bit more nuanced understanding of the risk, you can target your investments more efficiently. So I think, understanding risk and then relating that to financing is a key component and key part of our discussions going forward. Thank you so much, Kiran. So next, I'd like to invite Arun Kumar Tiwari. Arun, the floor is yours.
Respected delegates, good morning. I am from DFCCIL. Here I am presenting what mitigation measures DFC have adopted during construction of the dedicated freight corridor, and during operation what protocols we are going to follow. And after learning the things from the this operation, we will try to upgrade our structures so that disasters risk may be mitigated or minimized. First, what is DFC? Dedicated Freight Corridor is a special purpose vehicle created by Government of India in 2006 for construction of dedicated freight corridor of nearly 3,300 kilometers. Two corridors, EDFC from Ludhiana, Punjab to Dankun in West Bengal of nearly 1,800 kilometers. Western DFC is spanning from JNPT to NCR, namely Dadri, of nearly 1,500 kilometers. Till date, we have completed 62% of our total network, and commercial services are already under operation on this 62%. From this, Indian Railway is able to maintain their punctuality because maximum goods trains are shifted to our network. DFCCIL adopted three-stage philosophy for disaster risk mitigation. First is at the planning stage, then under operation and maintenance stage, and upgradation of structures after getting the feedback what we have done. And we have identified 5 major risks depending on climate and natural disasters. First is fog, temperature variation, then heavy winds, earthquake, and floods and heavy rainstorms. In India, during December to February, particularly in northern part of the country, northern and eastern part of the country, the visibility reduces even up to less than 100 meters. And presently our DFC track is not fenced, so there are possibility that mishappening may take place in the form of runover of cattle, and in extreme cases humans also. So for this, during planning stage itself, we have adopted ETCS1 level type of signaling for WDFC, in which train automatically stops if it crosses any danger signal. On EDFC, we have absolute block system, but during winter season in foggy weather, we modify it and make it 2 train system in a block section of 40 kilometers. We have protocol to reduce the speeds on the basis of aspect of the signal. If signal is showing single yellow, then driver is cautious to run the train so that he can stop the train within a distance of maybe 500 meters or 200 meters if he see any danger. On EDFC, we are planning to implement Indian developed technology named as Kavach. Trials are nearly under final stage. So on EDFC, we will implement this Kavach so that from fog, no casualty or anything may happen on DFC network. Next is the temperature. In Indian scenario, rail temperature is normally in winter 6 to 7 degree lower than the ambient temperature. So rail temperature in India ranges between 68 degree to -8 degrees Celsius. During summer, we face problem of buckling of the track, means track get distorted, and in winter, problem of rail fracture and belt fracture arises. For this, accounting these, how to mitigate these measures in development stage, we had adopted heavier track structure. Our single sleeper is weighing nearly 330 kg with respect to the what Indian Railway conventionally use 270 to 80 kg. We have gone for 350 mm ballast cushion. Due to these two aspects, the ballast resistance get increased, and in summer the possibility of buckling will be reduced. Similarly, for winter, we have adopted 110 UTS rails, namely we have imported it from Japan, and we have gone for concept of reduction in AT welding. We have minimized the use of AT welding, particularly in WDFC, only in yard area, in single yard of nearly 20 to 25 turnouts, maximum 20 to 30 AT belts are there. In block section, no AT belt, all belts are flash belt. So by that we have tried to reduce the chances of rail fracture and buckling. During maintenance phase, we keep on measuring the rail temperatures, so we can do distressing to avoid buckling. We keep on doing rail grinding, USFD testing, so that before any rail fails or belt fails, we withdraw that rail. And now we are in a stage of doing the trials for implementing some technologies which can detect the rail broken systems, and our signals get actuated accordingly. The third major problem in the country, particularly in the coastal region, is the strong winds. All structures are designed for, as per IS 875 part 3, for wind forces. Normally whole DFC comes under the nearly 39 to 44 meter per second. All structures are, including communication towers, are designed for that, and we have installed anemometers on all station buildings, so we are getting the real-time wind velocities. Accordingly, our station masters are controlling the speed of the trains, and we have a set protocol that when wind speed exceeds a certain value, we have to put a speed restriction. In extreme cases, we stop the train services. On WDFC, we are running double stack containers, so it becomes more important to take care for the wind forces. Accordingly, we have some operational protocols for reducing the speed in case of wind forces. The deadliest hazard is corresponding the earthquake. As per Indian codes, we have designed all our structures, since DFC is coming in zone 3 and 4, so we have designed all structures, including buildings, tunnels, and heavy cuttings. We have a cutting of nearly 28 meters in our system in NCR Delhi region. Similarly, formation height is also going 30 to 32 meters. So we have a lot of constructing all these things, duly accounting the forces as per Indian codal provisions. During O&M stage, we have a protocol that after major earthquake, all bridges are to be checked for the fitness, then only train services are to be allowed. And one major threat is, major hazard is heavy storm, rainstorm, and floods. In India, there are many cases of wash out of the railway formations, wash out of the bridge proper, bridge approaches due to heavy floods. So by gaining the experience from those things, we have planned our structures, we have designed our structures according to the hydrological calculations for 100-year return period for the major structures like bridges, and invent our drainage system related to track, adjacent to track, in cutting, in tunnels also we have designed it for 50 years return period. During design stage we have kept many things. We have identified all railway affecting works in vicinity of track up to 100 meters on upstream and downstream. We have identified and we have a set protocol with the state authorities who are maintaining those structures. And we keep on inspecting those structures. We found any deficiency and anything to do to improve its strength. So in every year we do that meeting with the state authorities, and all works are to be completed before onset of the next monsoon. We have system of monsoon inspection of the monsoon patrolling for the critical locations. If we receive weather forecast from the weather meteorological authorities, we have set system of communication protocol with the asset maintaining authorities, water reservoirs, maybe dams constructed under the NREGA also, because although the water reservoirs constructed through NREGA scheme are small in size, but when they get damaged 7 to 8 at a time, it may create flood. So incidences have happened that those ponds have broken and flood have occurred, all railway formation has been washed out. And so in that case traffic get disrupted for nearly 2 to 3 days. In order to avoid, since we have constructed this infrastructure for 24 hours running time, so we have to ensure that our services should run without disruption, and if any major disaster is going to happen, we get the information, we do all preparedness to reduce the risk by that disasters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arunji. I think, so we are seeing a shift. We went from energy to transportation, and I think most of you know Indian Railways actually probably owns one of the largest railway stocks in the world. The amount of railway stock that exists, rail line, etc. So it's actually, in a way, very inspiring to see the level of thought that's going into understanding risk, but also then putting into place operations systems to sensors to reduce speeds, etc. I don't know how much in all of our risk assessments. I don't know how many of us are actually looking at fog as a risk. It's something that doesn't strike you immediately as a risk. We think about earthquake risks, flood risks, but fog as a risk. Again, maybe a personal. Growing up in New Delhi, I remember getting up to go to school at 6:30 in the morning, and you're standing here, and I couldn't see where Kamal is standing, and before you know it, your school bus was on top of you. I mean, that's the level of fog we're talking about, and this lasts for several months. To see how the railway system is starting to understand that risk and putting it into your management of that risk is really impressive. One question back to you, Arunji. You've done this for the DFC. How is this translating to other pieces of railways infrastructure that, is it now is this process formalized? Is this process, how is this understanding translating into sort of a larger process system, etc.?
Actually, we are not doing anything new. These aspects are already formalized by the Indian Railways. When only thing is we are implementing in toto. And Indian Railways is also upgrading their infrastructure accordingly to minimize the risk for these. Indian Railways is also trying to implement or upgrade the structures. In fact, the Kavach, this project is started by the Indian Railway itself. We are borrowing from them, because DFC is just extended arm of Indian Railway. What technology policies Indian Railway frames for their network, we are following those policies, and we have some our compulsions, protocols. We have understanding with the World Bank and JICA also, that we have to follow these measures so that disaster risk can get minimized.
Thank you so much for that. So next, I'd like to invite Ms. Suranjana Gupta. Actually, yes, Ms. Suranjana Gupta first. I want to go from big infrastructure to community infrastructure, and then come to nature as an infrastructure. So.
Okay, let me see if I know this thing. to press. Okay. So good morning, everyone. And it's really a privilege for me to be here and speak with all of you. And I hope that I'm going to give you some food for thought as you go into your deliberations. A little bit by way of introduction about the WIRO Commission. We're a global movement. We're structured as a network. Our members are autonomous organizations. They are highly locally focused. Some of them are larger NGOs who have some substantial professional support. Others are very grassroots organizations. But the important thing to understand about us is that we work with organized women's groups located in disadvantaged communities, urban, rural, and indigenous. The organizations are women-led, but not necessarily women-focused only. And I think the other important piece to understand about us is that we want development policy and programs to work for women who are disadvantaged and for their communities. And we want to do it in a way that resets the configuration of power and changes the ways in which women relate to other actors. So it's both, for us, empowerment is both a means and an end to something. And I think the most important thing that I think I also want to say in this introduction to us is that we see women's efforts and their leadership as being not exclusively for women, as is sometimes is perceived, but as inclusive because their aspirations and their work tends to focus on the family, the household, and the communities that they're in. So a little bit about the, one sec. How do you do this? Oh, did I do that or somebody else? Okay, so just a little bit about the kind of work that women are engaged in. One is, of course, they're very much engaged in restoring natural ecosystems, whether it's soil restoration or reforestation or promoting mangroves, the promotion of solar energy. They do a lot of work which is in relation to emergency shelters. There's water and sanitation facilities which they're very involved in. A lot of work which is self-financed or financed through microfinance loans or self-help group loans around housing improvement, slum upgrading, which is all done incrementally over time. Some interesting examples I might come to on housing tool banks that have been done. Of course, the more conventional imagery around infrastructure groups are also very much involved in roads, footbridges, things like retaining walls, and then a lot of work around women and children's centers, which has again been something that women have done, particularly in the context of disaster. Okay, one second. Just some photographs to give you a sense of the work we do. That's women's groups in Padang restoring mangroves after a program which was a Cash for Work program, which was government-led, kind of didn't do so well, and then the communities along with the Department of Fisheries, I think, tested and developed a whole new strategy which succeeded. But again, the important thing to understand here is the success of regenerating the mangroves actually gave them a kind of credibility which allowed them then to advocate for road upgrading and road repair. So this is a pattern that we see constantly in our network, that women first have to have some resources to demonstrate what it is that they can do in order to build larger credibility and get the support and collaborate with government. You see there the young people who've been mobilized by women's groups to do backyard gardens, clean up the river in Kisumu in Kenya. Then some post-disaster reconstruction work around housing and settlement planning after the earthquake in Nepal. Rainwater harvesting structures, which a fantastic network in the northeastern part of Brazil, in the very poor, arid, semi-arid areas of Brazil, created a whole network of cooperatives through whom they promoted these roof water harvesting tanks, which then feed into these larger storage tanks, and which has then led them to work a lot on drip irrigation and change the agricultural model for small farmers, which in turn has allowed them to partner with government institutions and the Inter-American Development Bank to grow that work. This is some risk and resource mapping that has been undertaken by women's cooperatives who work in the central part of Istanbul, Kayıthane. Then you have in Gaziantep, which was recently affected by the earthquake, but this is pre-earthquake. I don't know if you can tell, these are before and after pictures of some paving that people have organized on the roads and the lighting that they've organized inside these areas. So I think one of the important things, again, to understand about women's ability to access infrastructure is that they haven't necessarily thought of it in the way that we're discussing it here, as in how do we build resilient infrastructure. But the way in which they look at it is often when they map disaster risks, and they say they often prioritize things like roads for improving access, but also things like lighting on roads, because for them to access those roads, the issue of safety becomes very important, and the issue of safety is very connected to whether or not they're going to use the roads and what that gives them access to, what markets, what resources, what labor markets they have access to, and that has a lot to do with the economy. And that concept came to us long ago from our members in a network in Canada who had done very exciting work with the city of Montreal on making the transport system safer for women to move around at night. Because they said that if people don't use the system at night, the economy really suffers. So I think, we are a North-South network, and we do a lot of exchanging on concepts and ideas and practices across our membership. So a little bit about, sorry, I'm going to go back. So a little bit about what is changing. I think there's a lot of exciting local partnerships happening at the municipal level, at the village level, at the barangay level. There's women are influencing the decentralized planning and budgetary processes. They are doing a lot around gathering data which is valued by local governments, particularly in the context of disaster. I think that also I should mention that globally women are increasingly being seen as an important stakeholder group who have to be part of larger global discussions, the high-level political forum and the SDGs. We are part of UNDRR stakeholder engagement mechanism. The two examples, recent examples I want to draw your attention to, just give me 2 more minutes please. One is that CEPREDINAC, which is the regional body, intergovernmental body of disaster management authorities in Central America, has a program for certifying grassroots leaders and indigenous women, training and then certifying them as their sort of official liaisons in the field, and that's completely shifted the ways in which women are now interacting with the national government. They have access to more planning, and therefore that planning is more effective in terms of reaching out to local communities during disasters. And second, of course, we have Asian Development Bank's Community Resilience Financing Partnership Facility, which is quite a mouthful, and there are at least 2 people in the room. Charlie Benson is here from ADB, and it's under her unit that we started producing the evidence of what women could do if they were given an opportunity to do it, and that created the part of the evidence base that went on to become the Community Resilience Partnership Program, which is really looking at scaling up investment in community resilience. And for us, the reason it's so important is that it's giving an opportunity to local women's groups to co-design and to collaborate with national governments in an institutionalized context to co-develop solutions that look at community priorities and women's priorities. And our network is also the part of the capacity building for local groups and local authorities. But minimally, I think the program is also exciting because it understands that the logic of supporting community-based work requires a different stream of resources that needs to be designed differently. So whether it's a different window, a different facility, but one way or other, that the logic is quite different when you're doing work that is more from the ground up. I see Shan Mitra is also here from FCDO. FCDO, the Nordic Development Fund, and the French have supported the facility for CRPP, and he was also present at some of the earlier discussions and the evolution of this program. So I just want to acknowledge that. But I think that, again, coming to what is challenging is that in all this work that women are doing, I think the two big challenges that I'll pick up are, one is that there's not much of an institutional memory of all this. And each time we find that mostly local groups have to keep re-establishing their credibility, rebuilding partnerships with institutions. It's usually when things go up to the larger sort of national institutions, it is because there are 2 or 3 strong institutional champions, or maybe even one, who open up space within the institution for the collaboration. But most of the time it's very hard to sustain this collaborative work when that individual is gone. So that is a big problem, and there's usually no transfer of that experience or that partnership to the next person who comes in, and so people have to start from the beginning. And the other piece, of course, is that financial mechanisms are not well aligned to the kind of capacities and priorities and needs that grassroots organizations and their networks have. So just a few points about the kinds of financial incentives and investments and policy incentives that are required. One is, of course, to enable grassroots organizations and local groups to access risk information. But it's not just the access, which I heard the SRSG from UNDRR speak of, but it's also understanding and analyzing that, and that informing the choices that people make. And I think that converting that information that people have into risk-informed choices is also a very critical part. And of course we know that there is always questions around what kind of local information is available, but there's also a question of interpreting that. The other thing is that I think we're entering a phase where we need to look at learning, training, capacity building in new ways. I think we have to look at longer time frames. Fortunately, the discussion on infrastructure allows us to do that, but you need to have processes of iterative learning, allow groups who get trained to actually test solutions, tweak the solutions and adapt them, making them very context specific. And this requires some kind of iterative funding and learning processes where people are allowed to test and perhaps fail and then try again. And I think that's a very important part of learning, and the kind of hand-holding and mentoring that would go with such a process, where you don't simply train and let people go off and do their own thing. So the other part is community-led scaling up processes. I think this has been shown a lot, that when communities actually train one another, there's a different kind of momentum and acceptability to that. So a lot of work can be done and accelerated through those kinds of processes. And I'm going to just say we need policies that incentivize and support partnership building, and set aside sort of financial resources. I've already talked about that with community-based organizations and networks. But I think the important thing is to work with these networks and organizations to co-design something that actually works for them. So I think I'll leave you with those thoughts then. Thank you.
Thank you, Suranjana. There's a lot there. So one point I do want to emphasize, which is not that a lot of those are important points, but the one point that one needs to always remember is, who are we designing infrastructure for? End of the day, it is actually people who are experiencing infrastructure. All of us are experiencing infrastructure. It's women, children, elderly, men, women. I mean, it's like all of us. Infrastructure is, our imagination of infrastructure usually is a big piece of infrastructure, a power system. But end of the day, it's all about providing services to people, to us, So co-design, end of the day, being part of that process of what is it that we need. And it translates to a lot of different things, These certain assumptions when you're thinking about infrastructure is, disruptions. We imagine disruption in power sector to be having a certain kind of impact. It actually may or may not. And this is where community engagement becomes really important. Communities may have already been adapting to that challenge. I remember a case study from Surat. They were looking at how the community, the small business owners were reacting to flooding. And they were already adapting. And how were they adapting? Surat is a textile manufacturing, one of the textile manufacturing hubs in India. And what were people doing? They were putting the production into their cars, and they were going and parking them on the flyovers. That's how they were getting away from the flood. Now, I'm not saying that's what needs, but I'm just saying that communities are actually already on the front line of these challenges. And when we're thinking about infrastructure and we're thinking about designing infrastructure, we have to engage with the stakeholders to start to see, how is it that they're already responding, and is there a way to get that into a formal process? So, Ranjana, I'm not going to ask you a question because I do want to respect time, but next but we will have a lot more conversations, and please feel free to this thing. Over to you, Madam Cheng.
Perfect. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today, and I'm going to go on a very high-level overview of things, and really please come and ask questions throughout the session and the next couple of days. I'll lower this a little so I can see you. There we go. So we talked today a lot about the cost of damage to infrastructure, and it's really grown significantly. In Canada, that growth is 1,250% since 1970. That's how much the cost of it has grown. Just last year alone, the insurable losses to the impacts of extreme weather has been $3.1 billion. Now that's just the insurable pieces. I wanted to give you one example. In 2021, we saw extreme events one after another in British Columbia, and it shows the compounding and amplifying effects. So British Columbia had a pretty hot season, pretty hot summer. This created heat domes, and we ended up with 619 premature deaths. Of course, the heat dome then led to an increase in wildfires and intensity of these wildfires. We actually had to evacuate 50,000 homes in one summer. Now you've got a very dry soil. We had an atmospheric river event. The soil was not able to absorb the water, which led to landslides and floods. And so 8 highways in this one province was damaged, and it cut off communities, and it disrupted Canada's supply chain from our busiest port. That's just one example of the things that we are facing in Canada. We know that these events are going to increase in intensity and severity. We need to double down our efforts, and we need to take action now. So we're with you. We think this is a really important conflict. And Building infrastructure that's resilient to the impacts of climate change from the onset. We've talked about this before, but from the onset, that is by far the most value for money that we can provide in terms of best results for our communities and our citizens. I want to talk to you specifically today about nature-based solutions. A number of our local communities in Canada are turning to nature-based solutions because they are cost-effective and they have multiple benefit solutions, so to managing disaster and climate change. In Canada, the most common nature-based solutions that we see are around wetlands, around urban drainage systems, such as the one you'll see in this picture, and then for the coastline, beach and dune restoration. The Rain Garden and Biosoil project in the city of Vancouver, this image here, manages 90% of the rainfall from the roads in the nearby surrounding roads. But it has a co-benefit of reducing the combined sewer overflow, so you don't need as big infrastructure there, and enhances habitat for pollinators and really provides that extra little bit of green space for the community. But nature-based solution is not without its challenges. Like all other adaptation aspects, Canada faces very similar challenges as those of you. So of course, we've talked about the funding gap. Not only is there a funding gap for infrastructure and what we kind of call the gray infrastructure, there are many programs out there that are not including nature-based solution as an eligible expense. So that is one area. There's also really a lack of awareness of nature-based solutions. Some actually think that it's not as effective. The tools and planning and frameworks that we have in terms of adapting to climate change underrepresent nature-based solution. And this is one of the challenges that we see that why it's not getting uptaken. One of the key challenges is the valuation and the benefits of co-benefits of nature-based solutions. There is, of course, the knowledge gap and the data gap in terms of understanding the performance and the technical guidelines and specs to be able to implement a successful solution. And then one piece that I wanted to highlight is that with all climate change adaptation actions, we need to focus and keep our attention on the most vulnerable communities, those that are probably most at risk and less able to adapt. We need to think about climate justice and equity in our actions. So in Canada, we have two programs that are funding nature-based solutions. One is our Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. It funds essentially natural infrastructure projects to increase resiliency in communities at risk. And so it's about $3.8 billion, and it has been around since 2018. We've created and funded 83 projects to date. We also have a project or a program called Natural Infrastructure Fund. This is Canada's first dedicated fund to nature-based solutions. And although it is small, $200 million, we are seeing some great results in it. And as our keynote speaker spoke, funding alone isn't going to be enough about this. So we have also some policy statements. Canada introduced its first national adaptation strategy this year, or I guess last year now. And one of the key parts of this strategy, the policy statement there, is that we are going to be tying federal funding to resiliency requirements. And what does this mean? They're going to need to do a risk assessment and also look at actions to reduce that risk, such as limiting the building in flood zones. We're going to be setting minimum guidance, standards, and codes that these projects will need to follow regardless of the local adoption of policies. And then thirdly, we want to incentivize nature-based solutions so that we can really look at how this can be really implemented. The other piece is the research, but research with a focus on implementation. We've been doing a lot of work to inform our guidance, codes, and standards so that they are climate informed for the future. This is managing coastal and riverine floods and erosion risks, reducing the urban heat island effects during peak heat wave events, reducing urban flooding during intense rainfall events. We also know that the work happens at the local level. So working with the local level to understand local municipalities, the elected officials, decision makers, to help them understand that there are a multitude of decisions or options available. If you've got a flooding situation, what are some of those nature-based solutions that you can take a look at? And we also have an advisory group made of many, many sectors of our economy to define the problem, design and implement research, and then put it into action by applying it. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about our community support. Capacity support. So it's great to put it out there to say here is the best guidelines and best practices, but it's really hard to do. We know that just putting and making available, one, we're going to make it available online, both in terms of mitigating against climate change, but also adapting to adapting for resiliency. But we are going to couple that with direct support as well as working with the practitioners. So expert practitioners working with local communities to get the actions going. We wanted to highlight one example. This is Nature-Based Solutions Living Laboratories. This is an opportunity to bring together a multidisciplinary team, the stakeholders, the right holders, into real-world environments. And we want to test the idea. So it sounds good in a model or in the lab, but does it work in the real world? So we'll do it in a pilot stage. We'll have predictive tools. We'll monitor this. And we bring that outcome back and we put it into our guidelines. So this is our living laboratories for nature-based solutions. We've got multiple examples. And then I would like to finish by just saying that we are very proud to have contributed to CDRI's upcoming biannual report on global infrastructure resilience. So our contribution is a synthesis of 10 Canadian case studies around nature-based solutions and how they overcame some of the barriers. So how did they do it in terms of innovative financing, regulatory support, inclusive governance. And I could go on for many, many more minutes, but I will leave it here and leave. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for, and in a way I wanted to ask both of you a question, because you touched upon capacity building and local needs, and you touched upon the gap in capacity building and institutionalizing the local participation in such kinds of solutions. So maybe 2 minutes each from your side in Canada. How are you engaging on building the capacity of communities? So you're sharing some examples. So part of it, I think maybe I also want to relate this to the understanding of performance of these things. One thing that comes up often when you're talking about nature-based solutions is the evidence is not there. And the perception is it requires a lot of maintenance. I've heard stories of, the mosquitoes are going to, I don't want to do this because the mosquitoes are going to come, and So there is a perception issue which relates directly to the community engagement, but then there is the building the evidence side. So maybe if you want to touch upon the evidence side, and then so you can come in and a little bit on the community's engagement part of this. So
Sounds good. Nature-based solution is just one piece, and infrastructure, we really do talk about it as a systems. So in terms of an integrated system, you don't want to think about an infrastructure as one asset. As we've discussed today, we've talked about infrastructure providing a service to communities, and the examples that I provided there in terms of nature-based solutions, in some areas, it's a given. When you're talking about coastal erosion and flooding because of sea level rise, building something between you, the dike, and the ocean makes a lot of sense. In other areas, in terms of a wetland, you are introducing things that you're not necessarily sure. So this is really, one, you need to raise the awareness. You need to monitor and show the performance. And one of the key benefits of nature-based solution is that it's, in most cases, it's at least a 25% less in terms of cost. And you really are able to get your community together for this as well. So there's one of those examples where nature-based solution not only deals with the resilience issue in terms of, for instance, the climate hazard or whatever, but it brings a community together, and it allows that long-term monitoring in together in that sense. But there is more work to be done in terms of valuation, in terms of the technical standards and the guidance that we need to give. It is an area that I think collectively that we could really look and learn from each other.
Thank you so much for that. So Ranjana?
Okay, I think with capacity building, I see it as how do we help communities to learn and demonstrate or test what they've learned on the ground. So, for example, everything that we do, so for example, risk mapping. When risk mapping is done by communities, it's actually a collective way of reflecting on what's at risk, what resources do they have. It's a way to start learning and owning that knowledge and keeping that knowledge inside the community. And of course there's a role for external actors, but usually what happens is when the emphasis on external actors doing the training, that person acquires most of the knowledge and then that person is gone. So there's it's important for us, I think, to keep the learning and knowledge and keep building that and reaffirming that in the community, because also that's something that communities can later leverage when they are doing other work. So they take the map and they are able to go to the municipalities and negotiate for resources to upgrade their infrastructure. So I think that is one kind of capacity building. The other kind, I think that the evidence base, I think the written evidence and the research, I would say that community networks, and we've not been that strong on, but I think what I would say is it's like the living laboratories. I think that the demonstrations are evidence and they're there to see, and they're very powerful learning tools or mechanisms more, because I know I was documenting case studies all the time. I'm not sure who read them and who learned anything from them. People were happy they were there, and we put our stamp on them, and that's good. That has a different function. But in terms of learning and transferring that learning, I think a demonstration teaches people by doing much more and lends itself very well then to transfer practices through peer learning, which again we've supported a lot. So we, for example, years ago in Gujarat after the earthquake, we brought a team of Turkish women survivors who had set up women and children centers there. They came here and looked at the work that women in Gujarat and Maharashtra were collaborating to do, and setting up women's spaces here and looking at how they were connecting community priorities to government programs. So in our network we've done a lot of exchanging and learning around solutions, and it's through peer learning which really inspires those who are learning, and change is transformational for those who are teaching, because they realize though they're disadvantaged and considered vulnerable groups, they have a lot to offer the world as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ranjana. Last point, because we've got the railways and the energy hats on here. In each case, if you think about communities' engagement, you're talking about flooding from NREGA's ponds that are getting built. That's actually completely community work that is building those ponds. So bringing the community in to understand, how their ponds may be contributing to the flood risk for the railways is again a point of engagement. And similarly on the energy side, a lot of decentralized solar systems in villages, in local rural areas are being managed by women groups and communities. So again, all of our infrastructure, as we're thinking of infrastructure, big infrastructure, there is a strong link to community and local participation. With that, I'd like to thank the participants. Thank you so much for the enriching discussion. We will have a second round of discussion as well, so don't go away anywhere. I would suggest if you want to step out and bring your coffee back in, maybe that is, Kamal, can we do that? If people go out, get their coffee back in. Yeah, and then we keep going with the discussion. So maybe 2 minutes to go get a cup of coffee and bring it back in. Thank you so much. And then, yeah, please. Come, make your